It's time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all. Craig, I'd like to start with you, and I would like to take a break from our constant conversations about Donald Trump, if you wouldn't mind. And I was surprised and a little bit disappointed to see the most recent news coming out of the Supreme Court, where Judge Alito has now joined Judge Thomas in some really embarrassing, I think, incidences of taking presents or trips without disclosing them. I just had lunch with a Chestertown town council person who was almost anal about separating the check from what I was going to do. It just seems like this is just an unbelievably odd gap in our ethics. What's your take on that?
You know, I think the story about Justice Alito is kind of another issue that the court faces, and I don't know the facts, so I don't want to comment on what he did or didn't do exactly now. But you know, the Gallup organization tracks the Americans' view of the Supreme Court in terms of their attitudes being favorable or unfavorable. And for 20 years, most of the time, it hovers around 50% favorable. Sometimes it gets to 60%. It might drop a little below, but it almost all the time, the favorable rating is above the unfavorable rating. And today, it crossed a number of months ago, and it's sitting at 40% favorable, 58% unfavorable, with a gap that is, by my eye, over 20-some years is the largest gap leaning to the unfavorable side that we've seen. Now, is that because of these transgressions or alleged transgressions? Maybe part of it. Part of it's also the decisions they're making, since the court's conservative. But we want to have confidence in the Supreme Court, and the only way to do that is to have confidence in the judgment of the justices. And I think this is another one of these debates, kind of like Presidential Paperwork Act, not to go into that territory, but it's one of these debates that I thought was settled sort of a long time ago. Because a long time ago, when I went into government, and it was the White House, but the counsel we got was do nothing that presents the appearance of a conflict, And so an example you gave of a public official saying, he'd pay for his own lunch, it's not because by paying for it, it would be illegal, although some of these laws have changed. It's the appearance problem. And so when we would go out, and it was very useful to spend time with knowledgeable people on industry questions, on economic issues. They'd want to do it over lunch. Sometimes they'd host a small dinner. But there was nothing illegal, particularly when I was in government, with doing that, having them pay for it. But to avoid the appearance, you paid your own bill. You didn't take trips. We had some, at times people would offer members of the staff a trip, or where there's a townhouse available, you're welcome to use it. Well, that has value. And the problem with the White House, in a way, is the same as the Supreme Court. There may be not even the appearance of an issue at the time that the offer is made, and if you accept it, but you don't know what's going to come before you, a year later, 2 years later. And then suddenly someone's suggesting, well, there's a relationship there, and somebody was offered something of value, and they accepted it. And so I think the court can't hold itself apart from this higher standard. I think they have to move in the direction which is now actually sort of codified for federal employees, to do things that avoid the appearance of conflict, and avoid doing things that would for the reasonable person appear to be a conflict. And if they do that, they'll stay out of this issue. I think the failure to do it, others can decide whether any law was broken, anything was, should have been reported, wasn't reported. But that's all kind of in the paperwork side of things. The damage is done as soon as there's an appearance of conflict, whether you're on the Supreme Court of the United States or a staffer in the White House.
Al, is that your take?
My take is pretty much like Craig's, certainly on the issue of conflict of interest and the appearance of conflict of interest. I mean, when you're in government, you've got to go the extra mile to avoid the appearance of conflict of interest because, you know, often these cases aren't legal matters as much as they are matters in public opinion, and they can really undermine you. I guess I look at this ethics, Supreme Court ethics question is two issues. One, do they need an ethics code? And the answer to that is yes. But second, you know, is it going to have any impact politically? Like, is it going to make any difference in 2024? And I think the ethics issue on the court, probably the answer is no. Look, the court, like other institutions of democracy, is having a very hard time in keeping up with the cultural and political change in the country. Part of it is structural, incidentally, because at any one time, a majority of the justices are going to will have been appointed by a past president. So they're not necessarily up with the latest zeitgeist. The court's problem is exacerbated because all these appointments are lifetime. And so, in a sense, once you're on the court, nothing's going to happen to you. They don't have any internal ethics code. That's one way they've fallen behind the rest of the country because ethics has become a much more salient concern for public officials. But nobody watches them. There's really no restraint. I mean, Chief Justice Roberts didn't want to testify on the ethics issue before Congress. Basically, the court says we'll take care of our own ethics, and we don't know all the facts, obviously, but pretty good indications they're not doing a great job. I think the court actually, Craig gave you the numbers of the approval. I saw some that were 41% in this week's YouGov, Economist YouGov poll. It was 41% approvals, still underwater. But you know, I think the country would like to see term limits. I've seen some polling that's about 2-1, 63-29, thinking that there ought to be term limits on the justices, and that's probably one reflection of this. But I think if it's going to become an issue, the court's going to become an issue, and it very well could be. It's not going to be because of its ethics, but because of its decisions. And we've already seen the impact of the reversal of Roe versus Wade. That could continue to be a major issue in 2024. Incidentally, after that, Quinnipiac did a survey on the approval of the court, and it was actually lower. It was 29-58, so only 29% approved right after that. I think that's an indication, and that's the lowest the court's ever been since they started polling. But I think that's an indication that the real danger or the real way the court could become a political issue is by its decisions, and it certainly has a number of them, like affirmative action coming up, that could be quite controversial.
Right. I guess the other thing that surprises me is to have people in those positions be so tone deaf about that appearance that you mentioned. How could that be? Why could there be a culture where somebody could take $100,000 flight and just simply think that they're filling an empty seat?
Yeah, it's very curious, and it's part of it, I think, goes to this, you know, separate branch of government, and they set their own rules and they have kind of their own code of conduct. Part of it, though, is the atmosphere in Washington, and I don't want to impugn all members of Congress, but, you know, consider this: if I took one of the leaders of Congress on either party to a fine steak restaurant in Washington, bought him a great dinner, beautiful bottle of wine, and handed him $10,000, I'd be guilty of all kinds of violations, and they would too for taking it. On the other hand, if I sent them $10,000 to their leadership PAC, and I traveled to Palm Beach to some resort and spent the weekend with their family, my family, and 6 or 8 other families of political people, donors. Perfectly legal. And what Congress has done is carved out for themselves this ability to acquire large sums of cash for their campaign committees, leadership committees, and go to beautiful destinations and have all the expenses paid for by their committee. Not a bad deal. I think it's if that's not the appearance of a conflict, I don't know what is, but that is the practice today. And so if you're sitting up there on, adjacent to the Capitol and the Supreme Court, you're watching people, elected officials flying in private jets, going to beautiful destinations, accepting large sums of money, maybe you say to yourself, well, I don't have nothing before me on the bench now. Why not do it? And so I really think it's a problem larger than just the Supreme Court. And we don't have the time to talk about campaign finance, but it goes to that, because I think it's created a climate where there's just this constant need to raise money, hold events, get all expenses paid, and it seeps into other elements in Washington, D.C.
Al, you have the last word.
Well, I couldn't agree with Craig more on that last point. I mean, look, I ran a group, the Democratic Leadership Council, and we raised money. If you wanted to go to Jazz Fest every year, you went to the DLC retreat, and guess what? You paid a lot of money if you're, a corporate lobbyist or an individual fundraiser. We're in a nice hotel in New Orleans. We would make, in those days, what seemed like a lot of money, $500,000 or $1 million on the event. You'd probably get 15 or 20 congressmen to come down. For a lobbyist, it's a great world, because they could spend that one weekend and get enough information to write memos to their bosses for a whole year. I mean, so it's a pretty attractive deal. But I think the other thing that is significant is that these are lifetime appointments. A member of Congress may never be called on it, but he or she has to go up before the people every 2 years. And if you're completely outrageous about how you're raising money and soliciting funds and taking sort of quasi bribes from your donors and such, that could be a very big issue in your campaign. But if you're on the court, it's never going to come up. I also think it probably has to do with, I think the lifetime appointment is really an important thing, but, the Supreme Court justices, for the most part, aren't people who, are scraping for the next meal. Most of them have been in, in high-powered law firms where they make a lot of money, where a lot of money is thrown around, where it's not unusual to go on corporate planes or work for your, your clients. So I think it's a combination of the atmosphere that they come from, the atmosphere in Washington. But boy, I think that lifetime appointment deal is the thing that really basically says no restraints.
We have to leave it there. Al Fromm, Craig Fuller, thank you so much indeed. We will see you next week.